Hello and welcome to Different Perspectives. I am Paul Ndiho. Today we look at a rugby madness in Uganda. Africa's best are battling for glory as finals loom. Uganda is buzzing with excitement as the 2025 Rugby Africa Cup heats up. This weekend, the finals will see Africa's rugby top nations are vying for a top spot at the 2027 Men's Rugby World Cup. The tournament began with eight competitive teams: Zimbabwe, Algeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Namibia, Senegal, Burkina Faso, and host Uganda, all showcasing incredible talent. Matches have taken place at the iconic Mandela National Stadium and Wankulukuku Stadium as the finals approach, and Ndiho Media catches up with rugby enthusiast and Pan-African writer David Monda, who is currently covering this tournament, for his insights on the tournament's surprises and who is likely to emerge victorious. You are currently in Kampala, Uganda, attending the Rugby Africa tournament. Bring us up to speed. What say you?
We've had a very great tournament. The weather on Sunday, when we had the match day 2, was good. It didn't rain, and the pitch at Nambole was in fantastic shape. We had a sizable number of Zimbabwean fans, Kenyan fans, and of course the Namibians were also there. But of course, the largest number were the Ugandan fans. And we had 4 matches on match day 2. And this first started off with the game between Morocco and Uganda.
Mm-hmm.
And we then had the game between Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal. And you had then Namibia and Algeria, followed by the final match, which was Zimbabwe versus Kenya.
David, what has surprised you the most about this year's Rugby Africa Cup? I know you're a big fan of rugby. Any surprises this far?
We have 8 teams in this, tier 1, what they call the tier 1 for Africa Cup, right? Which is Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Namibia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and Algeria. So there are 8 teams. But to be honest, if you look at the intensity and the technical capacity of these 8 teams, it seems that there's 2 different groups within those 8 teams. In other words, you have the 4 finalists, which is Zimbabwe, Namibia, who are in the final, and Kenya and Algeria, who are in the semi-final. And then you have the other 4 teams, which is Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Uganda, and Morocco. And you can see there's a gap in terms of the quality, with all due respect to the bottom 4 teams, but there's a difference in terms of the intensity of the Algeria, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Kenya teams, and the other, the other 4 teams. And I think this is reflected in the result, because the top 4 teams are competing for in the final and in the semi-final. And of course, the bottom 4 teams from number 5 to number 8 are competing for placing, within the Africa Cup ranking. And, unfortunately, your beloved Cranes are fighting for their survival because on match day 3, they are in a relegation dogfight with Côte d'Ivoire. And if they lose that game, they will drop down into tier 2, which I think will be a big embarrassment for the host. So I think that's one of the things a lot of Ugandans are crossing their fingers on.
David, don't worry. I got my people. They're going to do very well. In fact, it's like you're reading my mind. I was about to ask you, how has this tournament impacted Uganda's visibility on the Africa stage, on the global stage, especially now that they're the hosts?
Answer that question maybe with starting with a background, right? In terms of the results for match day 2 going into the final. So it happened that Morocco beat Uganda, which was a big surprise because Uganda is ranked higher than Morocco. And Morocco just came in from tier 2 into tier 1 as the 8th ranked team out of these 8 teams, which means it technically it's the weakest of the 8, right? It's number 8 out of from number 1 to number 8. Yet they were able to beat Uganda on match day 2. So that was a very big surprise. I think another interesting one was the Algeria-Namibia game. It ended 21-7 in favor of Namibia. So the gap there was about 14 points. So that tells you that the standards between the top 4 teams, are actually, the gap is reducing between Namibia and the rest of Africa, right? Because previously Namibia has been beating teams 30, 40, 50 plus points, a gap difference. I think another observation in terms of this tournament and Uganda's profile is it also showed the high level of competition between Zimbabwe and Kenya. And there's a feeling here in Kampala that the winner of this tournament would actually come from the winner of the Kenya Uganda game, who will end up meeting Namibia. And the game was very dramatic. Kenya was leading at halftime 18 points to 13. So that's just one try difference between the two teams. And the first half was really scintillating. It went back and forth between Zimbabwe scoring first 5 points and then Kenya coming back and scoring 5 points. Zimbabwe getting a penalty, going to 8 points. Kenya getting a penalty, coming back to 8 points. And the lead kept changing hands and it ended 18-13 at halftime. There's very little between Zimbabwe and Kenya in terms of technical skills and the understanding of the game, which is very high. The Ugandan referee, which is another controversy here, refused for the Kenyan fly half to restart the game because he said that the time, apparently the time had already run out. The time for the game had already run out. So if you score a try and regulation time is over, you can't take that, you can't restart the game because time is up. Because there was a feeling that during the game, the Ugandan fans were actually cheering for Zimbabwe against Kenya. So that did not make the Kenyans happy. And even the fact that there was a Ugandan ref at the center of the pitch, just added to the controversy of the game. But it was all in good banter. And, I think it was the best game of the tournament so far, of match day 2. The Zimbabwe-Kenya game, high level of technical kicking, good understanding of the pitch, very physical. And I think as a Kenyan coach, Water had said, the difference of the game would be who will make less mistakes, who will concede less penalties, and ultimately who will be able to take their points. And Kenya was stronger in the first half. I just think they ran out of gas in the second half. And Zimbabwe were worthy winners, and they will end up meeting Namibia. And I actually think Zimbabwe may end up beating Namibia.
Beyond the trophy now, the finals are coming up over the weekend. How important is this tournament for African teams, the ones that are vying and eyeing this qualification for 2027?
I think it's very important. You had asked me earlier about the importance of the tournament for the host country. I think this is a big one. Because last year, Uganda also hosted the Africa Rugby Cup that Zimbabwe won. So this is a big privilege for Uganda to host the tournament back to back. The difference this year is that the winner of the tournament gets an automatic ticket to Australia, to the World Cup. And the runner-up, of course, will play right here in Uganda, by the way, next week in the repechage. with the winner from Asia, which is the United Arab Emirates. So I think Zimbabwe will see themselves in a very good space because they played United Arab Emirates in a friendly before this tournament and they beat them. So Zimbabwe might feel, even if they lose to Namibia, they still have a good chance of beating the Asia champion, which was UAE, because they beat them in a friendly. But I think more fundamentally, this really showcased Uganda. You know, Uganda's not always
known
profile,
for
example, on the
sports.
tourist map. Right, in sports, this is sports tourism, very directly, sports diplomacy. You know, the beauty of the country, the hospitality, you know, what Uganda has to offer. You know, my unit is right by the lakeside. So every morning I get a fantastic view of Lake Victoria. You know, the air is fresh. The weather is perfect. It's not too hot and it's not too cold. You know, when it rains, it's a brief rain, and then, you know, it's sunshine, and everything is green. And of course, the food is fantastic. You know, I love bananas. I love matoke.
Bring me
it's
some.
very similar to a lot of what we have here in Kenya. So I think it's been very good for Uganda all around. But I think, in conclusion, you know, this has also really highlighted some of the challenges in the Uganda Rugby Union, because you can imagine losing to Morocco in your first game. That's just not a good start for the host, especially when Morocco is the weakest team out of all the 8. You know, that's not a good sign.
What happened? Home court advantage. The Ugandans are hosting. They should have, used that energy to literally take on Morocco.
Actually, for match day 2, the original game, their first game, unfortunately, was against the noisy neighbors, the Kenyans, and Uganda lost that game. You know, which, like you said, was home court. If there was any motivation for Uganda to win, really, this derby, you know, the Elgon derby, the Migingo derby, was something Uganda could have stepped up to win. You know, but be it as it may, even if Uganda lost, the Cranes lost match day 1 against Kenya, there was an expectation that they should come back harder and stronger, you know, to beat Morocco, because as we've said, Morocco was the weakest ranked team of all the 8, and they just didn't deliver. So I say that also in terms of responding to your earlier question about the image for Uganda rugby. It shows there's some systemic and structural problems in the rugby that needs to be looked into. Because if a tier 2 team, the champion of tier 2, which is Morocco, can come to tier 1 and beat Uganda, which had done very well last year, during the Africa Cup last year. You know, they took the champions, they lost to Zimbabwe by just 1 point. You know, that shows you that maybe there's some issues with preparation, you know, of the Uganda team. I think if you looked at it, the Kenya-Uganda team, the Kenya-Uganda game, you know, I think maybe the coaching staff for Uganda need to take a more technical approach to the game. You know, because, you know, the Kenyans seem to have a better technical understanding of the elements of the game, particularly the connection between the scrum half and the fly half. You know, if you contrasted the Kenya scrum half, Asati, to the Ugandan scrum half kept getting the ball and running with it, instead of giving a fast delivery to the fly half or to the pack, so they can ram the opposition and get yardage, and then move in phases like that, and pass the ball again, and ram and have the pack gain yardage. Because rugby is a game of tactics, but it is also a game of playing in the right spaces, right? Very similar to football, you know, when you have this pressing game. You want to always keep the game in your opposition's half. Like in football, you don't want to play around your goal area. You always want to play in the opposition's area, which is the least risky to you. And similarly in rugby, you always want to play in your opposition's half. You want to kick when you're deep in your defensive area. You want to kick the ball into the opposition's half. When you have your scrums, you want the scrum half to deliver the ball out quickly so that you can slowly gain the yardage, and you do that with the pack. So again, in contrast, it seemed Uganda seemed to be relying more on their running game, their seventh game, because Uganda is very good in seventh rugby. They are runners, which is good. But rugby is also developed to another higher technical level, where you need the pack to support the runners and the runners to support the pack. And I think the other thing Uganda need to think about is, their kicking game. They need to get a kicker who can get them yardage and get them out of their defensive area. I think a lot of times they were held back because the kicker was not able to find touch, meaning to find ground in the opposition's territory. And that was constantly kept Uganda on the defensive. And it made Ugandan players tired. And then also tactically, if we were to analyze Uganda-Morocco, I think Uganda has a bad tendency of starting games off slow. So you find with the Morocco-Uganda game, at halftime, Morocco was already ahead by 14 points to 0 for Uganda. Wow. So Uganda always seems to dig itself in a hole. And then the second half, they're trying to rally around and try and come back. And like you see, in the second half, they scored 12 points. But Morocco added 10 points of their own in the second half. And Morocco ended up winning 24-12. So I think technically that's also in terms of Uganda rugby and, the coaching and how they see the game. That's also something they really need to look into, about how do you play the game consistently and at a high intensity for 80 minutes? You can't just show up for 20 minutes or 40 minutes in second half. You have to be consistent.
I hope the Ugandans take that constructive criticism very, very kindly. I know a lot of fans will be.
I know my Kenyan fans will not be happy with me giving Uganda coaching tips, that you're gonna use to punish us next year.
but I like that. I like your ability to sort of like break this down in a very, very simple way. I mean, how do you switch from this? You are a prolific writer on all other subjects to sports. How are you able to do that?
Yeah, I have many hats, and I really enjoy the seriousness of academia. Which is one of the other hats I have. I love my work in media, because I'm able to allow people to tell their stories, and just really engage in these very amazing human experiences. But above all, I'm a sportsman. I broke my leg playing rugby in Kenya in high school, so I'm very passionate about the game.
Interesting.
My high school team is one of the best in Kenya, I'm proud to say, and I've consistently followed the game for many years, including the Kenya Shujaa, the Sevens, and of course the Uganda Cranes Sevens, as they've gone, around the world. I must add, Paul, one of the great experiences during this tournament has been the after party and the after hours entertainment. We've had excellent DJs, excellent bands and music. We've had to, it's very easy because you get to even interact and meet the players, these superstars that you see on TV all these years. You get to meet them in person. You bump into them off the pitch after the game during the media halls, And, I got to meet some of the coaches. I got to meet the chairman of the Zimbabwe Rugby Union, of course, Harriet Côte, the chair lady of the KRU, Kenya Rugby Union, and of course, Chairman Mensah, the president of Rugby Africa. Just bumping into people, and Mensah's incredible. He's a great president. He doesn't stand in the VVIP area. He comes and he wants to sit with the people in the Russia stand, in the regular people's area. For media like myself, the players are accessible, obviously within certain spaces when they're not playing. And I think the tournament's been really good. But I must say, Paul, I think one of the concerns here has been the ticket prices. Coming from North America, it might not be something that I think too much about, but I think it's something you really need to consider. Because asking people on the ground here to pay $10, $15 for a ticket, that's very expensive, especially for a Ugandan or an East African or regular people here on the ground. That's more than 2 or 3 days worth of income for many people.
To your point, I wanted to go back to some of the things that I talked about earlier. You talked about some challenges. What challenges does rugby as a sport face in Africa when it comes to funding, infrastructure, and you as a fan, what do you see maybe going forward? How can they grow this sport to become, a big international sporting event?
You asked a really good question, and maybe we should segment this question into two parts, because for Rugby Africa is in two parts. We have Rugby 15s, which is what we have right now, the Africa Cup Rugby, right? But we also have Rugby 7, and I think we need to unpack both separately. Now, if we're going to talk specifically about Africa 15s, and even Africa 7, I think generally the big issue has been player welfare. Most of our players in Africa, I think apart from maybe you just say Namibia and Algeria, most of the Kenyan team is local, most of the Ugandan team is local. A large part of the Zimbabwean team is local, though there's also quite a few of their players that play abroad. So I think that creates its own challenges. So for a lot of the country, let's take for example Uganda and Kenya that have homegrown a lot of homegrown players. I think that there needs to be a lot more funding and investment in coaching and in terms of the technical aspects of the great game, emphasizing on player welfare. One of the challenges with 15th rugby is, the Africa Cup is usually the only time, apart from in the context of Kenya and Uganda, the Elgon Cup between the two countries, when we can actually see high-level competitive 15th rugby. Because in Kenya and Uganda, you'll find most of the year, these players are involved with their clubs. A lot of them get injuries, and they may not get sufficiently compensated. I'll give you the case of Kenya in particular. In terms of improving African rugby, we've had management issues. Our past chairman recently resigned because of some of the wrangles in the Kenya Rugby Union. So I think union matters and management issues are one of the issues. Player welfare in terms of funding and welfare would be another one. But also thinking about how to get more tournaments where tier 2 teams and even maybe the lower 4 ranked teams in the tier 1 get more exposure to play, the Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya, and Algeria. But also, Paul, we have to also remember, every time Namibia goes for this World Cup, they end up getting smashed, 50, 60, 100 points. And that's also not a good image for the continent, because it shows us that even the best of the best from the continent, of course, outside of South Africa, which is at a different level.
The Springbok.
The Springboks, right. So with Namibia have been playing this World Cup since the 90s, and every year they get smashed. They get devastated. They're still to win a game at the Rugby World Cup in all these years. And they've got close. I think they've improved. But I think that's also something that we really critically need to look at on the continent, right? To say, how can even the best of the best from the continent, how can we then compete with the tier 2 teams at, in international world rugby, right? This would be the Portugals, the Spains, the USA, the Romanias, and
Australia,
so
New
on and so
Zealand.
forth.
Hmm?
Australia, New Zealand, now those would be tier 1. Those are now at the highest of the high. But I think building, taking baby steps. I think if we need to get more competitive with the teams like Fiji, the teams that are between position 10 and 20, so considering Namibia is ranked in the low 20s, same with Zimbabwe and Kenya and Uganda in the 30s. How do we bridge that gap between the number 10 and 20 and our African teams which are between number 20 and 40? How do we bridge that gap up, push it up? Because trying to beat the Springboks or trying to beat New Zealand might be a step too far, at least initially. So there's a lot to be done, Paul. But I remember I also mentioned there's the 7th game. And I think one of the challenges with the 7th game has been that, it's generally from Africa been dominated by Kenya and South Africa. The Bliss box, right? And you talked about investment in African rugby. I think the management of African rugby really needs to push world rugby to go back to the old format, whereby teams like Uganda, Zimbabwe, that were developing very well in their 7th, could actually then get to a point where they could play the tier 1 countries like, the Kenyas and the South Africans and the Fijis and New Zealand consistently. So there's a lot of work to do, and hopefully, the management can sort a lot of these challenges out.
Very briefly, any final?
Unfortunately, still see Namibia winning it all. But in the repechage, I think Zimbabwe have a chance to qualify through the back door, through the repechage tournament. But I think on a positive note, I would say that Namibia or Zimbabwe, whoever wins the final, I think they will make a much better show at the World Cup because they've been severely tested. This has been a really, really tough set of games, particularly the semi-finals and the finals. I think for Uganda, they cannot afford to lose the last game because they will be relegated to tier 2. If they lose to Côte d'Ivoire. And it's not a guarantee that they will beat Côte d'Ivoire. Because remember, the guys from Côte d'Ivoire, most of them play in France. And they're very big boys. So they eat a lot of that fufu, and well-off rice. So, so Uganda better bring their A game. Because I know one or two key players from Uganda, Cranes, were having management issues with the board, and maybe they were sidelined. But I think all that off-pitch drama, the Uganda Cranes need to really get this serious because they want to stay in tier 1, so that next year they can also be playing with the Namibias, the Zimbabwe's, the Kenyas, the Algerias, and Moroccos, and so on. But also remember, Paul, this will devastate Uganda's ranking. When Morocco beat Uganda, now Morocco's gonna go much higher. Uganda is gonna sink in its ranking. And if Uganda happens to lose and go into tier 2, then we are looking then at a situation where their ranking will hurt. And what I mean by that is then the quality of opposition that you can play. We talked about these games that you need preparation for in order to improve your rugby. If your ranking is lower, generally higher ranked teams don't want to play lower ranked teams because they don't see the benefit of that, right? You always want to play a higher ranked team because you feel you get a better, stronger competition to improve yourself. And I think if the tragedy to Uganda, their ranking is already gonna go down because they lost to Morocco. But if they lose to Côte d'Ivoire and they go into tier 2, they will have to now rework their way into tier 1, but their ranking is gonna go down a lot. And that's really gonna be a huge demotivator for rugby in the country. So I think match day 3 is really critical. The Uganda fans need to step up, and they need to ensure that Côte d'Ivoire does not beat them. And they need to be nice to their Kenyan neighbors, because Kenya fans might decide to return the favor and cheer for Côte d'Ivoire because of the way Uganda fans cheered for Zimbabwe. But I guess that's a story for another day.
David Monda, thank you so much for your insight. We'll leave it there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. We want to know what you think about the 2025 Rugby Africa Cup. Share your comments in the comment section below. Perhaps don't forget to follow, like, share, and subscribe to Paul Ndiho on Substack, X, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and YouTube.